Good morning, everybody. If you want to follow along in your Bibles, turn to the end of 1 Samuel. We're going to be wrapping up some things there today, but it will be also on the overhead. That's not what you call it. That's not the right word, is it? I sound like I'm from the 60s, don't I? The screen. And then we'll have my flannel graph that I'll bring in here in just a minute, too. So we've been studying the life of David, but actually as we've been doing that, we're actually paralleling that, studying the life of Saul. Interestingly, in the Hebrew Bible, Samuel's one book. And it wasn't until the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of Hebrew Scripture, when the Septuagint was put together, about 200 years before Jesus was born, they divided Samuel up into 1st and 2nd Samuel, and so that's kind of been the accepted norm now, and that's why we have 1st and 2nd Samuel. And really, 1st Samuel, even though we've looked at now 9 lessons on the life of David coming out of 1st Samuel, 1st Samuel's really more about Saul, and then 2nd Samuel's more about David. So we've witnessed Saul make a lot of poor choices, haven't we? But today may top them all, okay? In this section of 1 Samuel, it kind of reminds me of the way the networks cover the Olympics. Because, you know, in the Olympics, there's a number of events that are taking place at the same time. And so a network can't cover all of them. So what do? Well, now they put it on several channels, but most of us can remember when one network covered it, and so they would tape the other things happening at that time, and then they would try to kind of interweave all of that with the live broadcast. And if you didn't know any better, if they didn't say this is live, you would just think everything was seamless, right? That's the way this chapter, what we're going to be looking at today, works. The author of 1 Samuel tells these last chapters in a way that I think his purpose was to contrast Saul with David. And these events read as if they are chronological, but actually they overlap. And I'll try to explain that as we get more into that today. Especially when we get to chapter 31. So, as way of short review, 1 Samuel chapter 28, the Philistine armies have gathered at Shechem. This is the battle that David nearly found himself dragged into, right? On the Philistine side, he was working with Achish, the king of the Philistines. And then Achish decided, because of the advice he got from other Philistine leaders, to send David back. You remember that? Okay, so here's Saul's reaction as the Philistine army gathers. In chapter 28 and verse 5, it says, when Saul, this is hard to do, when Saul saw the Philistine army, he was afraid. Terror filled his heart. So Achish has apparently put together this coalition. We read a lot about kings in the Old Testament, but really what you need to be thinking more like in many cases is someone who's over a city-state. Okay, these aren't huge kingdoms. In fact, you have a number of Philistine kings, and they're really almost like the leaders of cities. And so they put together this coalition, and I'm sure they may have wanted to label it Operation Shock and Awe. Because the purpose of this coalition is to break the back of the army of Israel. And the strategy appears to be that they want to divide Israel up right down the middle from east and from west. So here's the sad part. Saul inquired of the Lord, but the Lord did not answer him by dreams or Urim or prophets. Again, what's the Urim? We've talked about this a couple of times, but I want to make sure everyone understands what that means. Right. It would be similar to tossing dice where you get a yes and no answer to questions. And don't ask me to explain all this theologically, but apparently it was a way that God chose to communicate to the high priest during that time. And so Saul being king, he would normally have the high priest ask these questions using the Urim and Thummim. But he doesn't have that now. It's been removed from him. In fact, David has it now. But this response on the part of the Lord, well, it's like Saul, too little, too late. I want you to imagine his dilemma. He is outmatched militarily. He is directionless spiritually. And so he progresses from fear to terror to utter panic. He is desperate. And desperate people often employ poor choices in trying to take care of their desperation, don't they? In an attempt to escape defeat or frustration. And so Saul makes a desperate decision. Since he can't seem to get God's attention, he decides that he's going to try to find out an answer to his dilemma through a medium. Now, this practice is strictly forbidden in the Old Testament in a number of places. I'm going to spare you reading all of them, but this one sums it up pretty good. Deuteronomy chapter 18 and verse 10. It says, "Let no one be found among you who sacrifices their son or daughter in the fire, who practices divination or sorcery, interprets omens, engages in witchcraft or casts spells, or who is a medium or spiritist, or who consults the dead." And Saul knows this. How do I know Saul knows this? If you peek back at verse 3, we're told one of the good things Saul did when he was king is he expelled the spiritists and the mediums from Israel. Okay? But he's desperate. And so his attendants tell him, "We are aware of a medium in Israel." Some translations, I think the King James Version calls her a witch. So we have this idea of the witch of Endor, right? We know that there's this woman in Endor. By the way, Saul's on Israel's battlefront. I'll show you, we'll look at a picture here in a minute of how all of this worked out. But he's at the military line there. He's at Israel's battlefront. And Endor's about 6 miles away. And guess in what direction? On the other side of the Philistines' camp. So he's going to have to cross enemy lines to get to this woman in Endor. And the truth is, anytime we dabble in the occult, my brothers and sisters, anytime we dabble in the occult, we are crossing enemy lines. And that's true whether it's consulting mediums or whether it's spiritists or fortune tellers or psychics or horoscopes. All of this is under the occult. And here's something that you may disagree with me about. We picture stuff like that as simply being, well, we shouldn't do it because it's just not appropriate. It's kind of like that's just fun and games. I believe there are powers in the occult. And when we dabble with that, we are dabbling with people on the dark side or things on the dark side. It's not fun and games. We'll get to that. I don't think I have a clear answer, but I'm going to give my best answer to that when we get there, okay? It is. And so, Saul disguises himself. I don't know exactly how he did that, but he goes at night to see this medium. Why does he dress in disguise? I can give you at least two reasons. Number one, in ancient battles, you kill the king, you've pretty much won the battle. Okay? But secondly, Saul, having been the one that cast mediums out, he doesn't want this woman to know who he is. By the way, and I don't mean this as a absolute, but just as a general statement. You might say like a proverb. When we wait until dark to do something, chances are whatever it is we're waiting to do isn't going to be good. Listen to the way Job put it in Job chapter 24. He says, when daylight is gone, the murderer rises up, kills the poor and needy, and in the night steals forth like a thief. The eye of the adulterer watches for dusk. He thinks, no eye will see me, and he keeps his face concealed. In the dark, thieves break into houses, but by day they shut themselves in. They want nothing to do with the light. I bet Lane could attest to the fact that nighttime probably more things go down than during the day. Yeah, and that's probably only changed in the last couple of generations since women have entered into the workforce more. Yeah. He arrives at this woman's house. And he says, consult a spirit for me and bring up for me the one I name. And David, this is going to get to a little bit of what you were asking about. I want you to notice her response. Well, in a minute anyway. But the woman said to him, surely you know what Saul has done. He's cut off the mediums and spiritists from the land. Why have you set a trap for my life to bring about my death? See, she knows what she's doing is violating the law. And she's thinking this could possibly be a sting operation. So verse 10 says, Saul swore to her by the Lord, swore to her by the name of Yahweh. As surely as Yahweh lives, you will not be punished. Get this. Saul swears by the name of Yahweh that she will not be punished. He swears by the name of the one he's been disobeying. And then he asks her to summon up, to conjure up Samuel, whom we were reminded in chapter 28 and verse 3 is dead. And so verse 12 says, when the woman saw Samuel, now this is a little bit humorous to me. She's a medium. She claims she can bring people back from the dead. But when she saw Samuel, she cried out at the top of her voice and said to Saul, why have you deceived me? You're Saul. The king said to her, don't be afraid. What do you see? The woman said, I see a ghostly figure coming up out of the earth. What did he look like? He asked. An old man wearing a robe is coming up, she said. Then Saul knew it was Samuel, and he bowed down and prostrated himself with his face to the ground. Why was she so shocked that she saw somebody? That could very possibly be it. she's a fraud that pretends to be doing this, and here something's actually happened and it shocks her. But I still will say, I believe that there is stuff that goes on with the occult. But perhaps she's a fraud. But here's the question. I think this is really what David was getting at a minute ago too. Why would God use something that he has said is wrong to accomplish this conversation for Saul? And here's my answer, David. It's not very satisfying, but it's about the best I can do. If God wants to use Samuel to bring a word for Saul, he can do it. And if God wants to bring Moses and Elijah back to visit with Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration, God can do it. That's right. That's right. True. And so after rejecting Samuel's message for years, Samuel's been telling Saul for years what God is going to do. What is Saul expecting Samuel to say right now? And so God allows Samuel to speak from the dead and to speak a word of judgment on Saul. Verse 15. By the way, Samuel seems a little grumpy. Leave me alone. Samuel said to Saul, "Why have you disturbed me by bringing me up?" "I'm in great distress," Saul said. "The Philistines are fighting against me, and God has departed from me. He no longer answers me either by prophets or by dreams. So I have called on you to tell me what to do." Samuel said, "Why do you consult me, now that the Lord has departed from you and become your enemy? The Lord has done what he predicted through me. The Lord has torn the kingdom out of your hands and given it to one of your neighbors, to David. Because you did not obey the Lord or carry out his fierce wrath against the Amalekites, the Lord has done this to you today. The Lord will deliver both Israel and you into the hands of the into the hands of the Philistines. And tomorrow you and your sons will be with me. The Lord will also give the army of Israel into the hands of the Philistines." Now, what makes Samuel's message from the grave so extraordinary is how ordinary it is. There is nothing new that Samuel says to Saul. He's covered all of this with him before. In fact, it's Samuel's ancient version of "told you so." This is exactly what he told Saul was going to happen back in chapters 13 and 15. And as David pointed out, he offers not a word of encouragement. He offers not a word of hope for Saul. It's simply too late. And because Saul failed to obey God, God rejected Saul. He isn't listening to Saul now because Saul didn't listen to him for 40 years. And you know what? Saul still doesn't seem to get it. I mean, we've watched this guy reject God and be blatantly disobedient to God, and he tried to kill God's anointed, an innocent man, and he presided over the genocide of the priests at Nob, and he still doesn't get it. And he is now experiencing the fulfillment of Samuel's earlier prophecies. And man, how much more blunt can you get than Samuel saying to him in verse 19, tomorrow you and your sons will be with me. Well, at this, Saul comes unglued. His knees buckle. He falls to the ground. He is paralyzed like he's been zapped with a stun gun. We've come a long way from that man who had been chosen to be king, who was described as being a head taller than all the other men in Israel, a giant of a man. And now he's a pitiful heap. And it's tragic. It's tragic. What had begun with so much promise. But it shouldn't surprise us, because this is the logical outcome of the path that Saul has chosen. And even the witch of Endor, or maybe I should say the medium of Endor, even she takes pity on him. She tries to get him to eat. And his response is, he refused and said, I will not eat. But his men joined the women in urging him, and he listened to them. Joined the woman in urging him, and he listened to them. He got up from the ground and sat on the couch. The woman had a fattened calf at the house, which she butchered at once. She took some flour, kneaded it, and baked bread without yeast. Then she set it before Saul and his men, and they ate. Now, as I was reading this, as I've been reading this the last week, I couldn't help but think, how long would the preparation of this meal even take? She's got to butcher some beef. She's got to take some yeast and make some bread. People just weren't as much in a hurry. I mean, they would have gotten to go today, you know. She would have run down and gotten something to go. But then she set it before Saul and his men, and they ate. That same night, they got up and left. This is Saul's Last Supper. We might even say it possibly is Saul's last meal. So, here's where the interlap comes in. You know, I was telling you about the way they do the Olympics. Well, here's where we've got an interlap of stories taking place. We looked at chapters 29 and 30 last week, when David and his men parted company with King Achish, right? And the Philistine army. The Philistine army's heading north toward Jezreel. David and his men are heading south toward Ziklag. Each probably reaches their destination real close to the same time. They're traveling about the same distance, which means that Saul and the Israelite army are perhaps fighting the Philistines at the very same moment that David and his men are pursuing the Amalekite raiders. Okay? The way the text reads, we would think those are two different times, but actually when you put the stories together, they're probably nearly, or if not, overlapping each other. And one of the reasons we know this is David learns about Saul's death on the third day after David's victory against the Amalekites. We see that in 2 Samuel 1 in verses 1 and 2. So David attacks the Amalekites, and he comes out totally victorious, while Saul's story, taking place about 100 miles to the north, has a very different outcome. So, let's go now to chapter 31 and verse 1. Now the Philistines fought against Israel. The Israelites fled before them, and many fell dead on Mount Gilboa. The Philistines were in hot pursuit of Saul and his sons, and they killed his sons Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua. The fighting grew fierce around Saul, and when the archers overtook him, they wounded him critically. Once again, let's understand, this is the battle that David would have been a part of, but on the Philistine side. Okay? Due to his duplicity, due to his not telling the truth to King Achish, he very well could have been a part of this battle. And this is the battle that had Saul the night before shaking in his sandals. Saul being the king. I want you to picture this. He's got thousands of men surrounding him. He's like the hub and the wheel with all of his soldiers surrounding him. And as the battle goes against Israel, they retreat to Mount Gilboa. Now here's a picture. I hope you can see it somewhat anyway. And it's kind of hard to read those designations, isn't it? You see the second designation from the left. That's Mount Gilboa that it points down to. I told you, think hill country, okay? This is Hill Gilboa. Maybe even Mound Gilboa, okay? This is not a mountain, but that's the way they referred to them. So that's where they retreat to. Now, this is up to speculation, but you see that the traditional site, that foreground one, that's where Saul and his sons end up dying, is in that area. But you can see where the actual battle took place. That third one from the left, that is the Jezreel Valley. And that's where the heat of the battle would have taken place. So they're battling there. Things start going bad. Israel's retreating up onto the hill of Gilboa. Why? Well, strategically, it's always best to have the high ground. But secondly, the Philistines were known for their chariots. This is the Iron Age, and they were far advanced from other peoples as far as their use of iron. And they've got chariots, but chariots can't do very well in the hill country. So it's a defensive mechanism to go up to Mount Gilboa. But the size of the Philistine army is just so big that the army of Israel is overwhelmed. And from this higher ground, Saul probably watches in anguish as his 3 sons are trying to be the last line of defense to protect their dad. And he watches as they are killed. The first casualty mentioned is whom? Jonathan. Man, doesn't that break your heart? This is a good guy. Everything we know about Jonathan is good. And yet this good guy dies in defense of his father. By the way, Saul had another son. His name is Ishvi. We read about him in 1 Samuel 14 is where we're introduced to him. But he's not involved in this battle. I mean, he's not killed in this battle. Why not? Well, possibly he either escaped or more likely he wasn't even in the battle to begin with. I don't know. Maybe back then they had a designated survivor. Maybe he was left behind in the event that everyone else was. We don't know, but he's not mentioned here. In fact, he's going to reappear in 2 Samuel, but his name is changed at that point. He's then known as Ishbosheth. So, while the Philistine chariots can't handle the high ground, guess whom among the Philistines can? The archers. So the archers begin making their way up the hill, and then they take target practice on Saul. And Saul is critically wounded. Now, his wound is not instantly fatal. And Saul's been in enough battles to probably know from where his wound is, and we're not told, but he may know, I've got hours, I may even have days that I could live. And now he becomes terrified that he might still be alive when the Philistines come and take him, because he knows what happens to people like him. In ancient times, a king or the leader of an army, when they're captured, they were terribly mistreated. They were tortured. They were abused. And so verse 4 says, Saul said to his armor bearer, "Draw your sword and run me through, or these uncircumcised fellows will come and run me through and abuse me." But his armor bearer was terrified and would not do it. So Saul took his own sword and fell on it. We aren't told what the armor bearer feared. My guess is maybe he, like David, feared the idea of raising a hand against God's anointed. But maybe he feared what would happen to him if he was alive when the Philistines came. And so he also falls on his own sword. There's nothing pretty about this. There's nothing noble about Saul's death. Even here, when he finds himself in a completely hopeless, desperate situation, Saul does not cry out to the Lord. Saul is still taking matters into his own hands. Verse 7 says, when the Israelites along the valley and those across the Jordan saw that the Israelite army had fled and that Saul and his sons had died, they abandoned their towns and fled, and the Philistines came and occupied them. So picture that. Picture this. Picture these women gathering their kids. They're leaving their house. They're fleeing, and almost as soon as they get out of the city, here's the Philistines coming in, and they're just taking over. Panic ensues. Verse 8 then says, the next day, when the Philistines came to strip the dead, they found Saul and his 3 sons fallen on Mount Gilboa. They cut off his head and stripped off his armor. And they sent messengers throughout the land of the Philistines to proclaim the news in the temple of their God, their idols, and among their people. They put his armor in the temple of the Ashereths and fastened his body to the wall at Beth-shan. A number of us have been to Beth-shan. Y'all remember that? It was a Greek city, David. No, I'm sorry, it was a Roman city, and it's pretty well, I mean, they've excavated it. It's one of the better excavations in Israel. Earthquake, remember? And the pillars had fallen different ways because of the earthquake. Well, it's there in Beth-shan that they hung the body of Saul and his sons. They are quick to turn the corpses of Saul and his sons into a propaganda campaign. They put his armor in the temple of their female goddess of war and sex, Ashtoreth. In 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 10, we're told that they took Saul's head and put it in the temple of Dagon. And in this way, what are they doing? They're doing like ancient armies did. They are declaring the God of the Israelites has been defeated by our gods. Saul, through his disobedient life, gives the enemies of Israel an opportunity to mock and to dishonor Yahweh. This was a great day for Philistia. And we see this happen today, and it's tragic. Today there's some publicly Christian person. Maybe it's a televangelist. Maybe it's just a person who is outwardly very outspoken as a Christian, and something happens in their life where they find themselves embarrassed, and the public just almost seems to rejoice over that. They laugh at God. They mock the Christian faith. and it greatly dishonors the Lord, but it is precipitated by the believer. Isn't that sad? I'm hoping this heater's going to turn off here in just any minute now. So here's what happens next. When the people of Jabesh Gilead heard what the Philistines had done to Saul, all their valiant men marched through the night to Bethshan. They took down the bodies of Saul and his sons from the wall of Bethshan and went to Jabesh, where they burned them. Then they took their bones and buried them under a tamarisk tree at Jabesh, and they fasted 7 days. Jabesh Gilead is about 10 miles southeast of Bethshan. Now, the inhabitants of Jabesh Gilead had never forgotten that very early in Saul's reign, about 40 years before this, they had been rescued by Saul. Here's briefly what happened. Nahash, the Ammonite, had come against them. And we read this. Nahash the Ammonite went up and besieged Jabesh Gilead, and all the men of Jabesh said to him, "Make a treaty with us, and we will be subject to you." But Nahash the Ammonite replied, "I'll make a treaty with you only on the condition that I gouge out the right eye of every one of you, and so bring disgrace on all Israel." Well, the elders thought about that. That doesn't sound like too good an idea. So they said to him, "Give us 7 days so we can send messengers throughout Israel. If no one comes to rescue us, we will surrender to you." Doesn't this seem like, isn't that odd? Can you imagine any war taking place today and you're about to capture the enemy, and the enemy says, "Wait, would you give us 7 days and let us see if we can gather up some people who can help us get out of this? And if we can't, then we'll surrender." But that's what Jabesh Gilead does. And apparently they get word to Saul. Saul marches with his army all through the night, and they get there and they destroy the Ammonite army. They rescue Jabesh Gilead. And so now these men, out of their gratitude for what had been done for them 40 years before, they come to make sure that Saul and his sons get a decent burial. That they're no longer, the body is there to be abused by the Philistines. Winston Churchill, early in World War II, the Allies had a major victory, one of their first major victories in World War II in North Africa. I mean, I don't know if you've ever followed the advance of the Allied armies in World War II, but basically we begin in Africa and then push our way back up into Europe. And so one of the very first major battles that the Allies actually won, after it was over, this is what Churchill said. "This is not the end. It's not even the beginning of the end, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning." I think he was instilling in his people the fact we've still got a long way to go here. Don't be thinking this is over. But here's Saul. Saul failed. Saul died. But his death is not the end. In fact, his death is actually the end of David's exile. Saul's whole life points to the fact of just how desperately Israel needed a man after God's own heart. But as we're going to see, David also failed, didn't he? And David died. David wasn't Israel's deliverer either. You might say David's death wasn't even the end of the beginning. Or, I'm sorry, the beginning of the end. Because Israel's ultimate hope, as well as the hope of all people, was going to come through a son of David. His name is Jesus. A man who never sinned. a man whose death was not due to a failure on God's part. In fact, Jesus' death was God's purpose.